Okay, sweet. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for coming to this talk. This is the second talk that I've given at a RailsConf. And first one that I gave was on internationalization, and there were like maybe 15 people in the audience. And now there are a lot more. I guess this is a more popular topic. I don't know. So, cool. So again, thanks all for coming. I'm Cameron Dutro. Work for the U.S. government. No, not really. I work for Twitter. I'm on international engineering, which explains the topic of my previous talk 2 years ago. You can follow me at Camerotron on Twitter. Look at me on GitHub as well. A little bit of personal background. This is my cat. He's pretty cute. His name is Chester. You can follow him at catwithtail. All right, so we're going to do a little bit of an interactive exercise before I dive into the deep technical portions of this. How many, if you raise your hand, if you've ever written Rails 2 code? You guys are, wow, look at that. Okay. Nice. How many of you in your Rails 2 code saw maybe a query that looked like this? Yeah. There's a ton of strings in here. There's not really an object-oriented way to construct queries in Rails 2. So thank heavens for Rails 3 and 4 because they introduced a much more chainable object-oriented pattern for doing query construction. So how many of you wrote Rails 3 or 4 code that looks like this? That's pretty much the same thing as before. And I don't want to say, you're doing it wrong, but you're doing it wrong. Right? So let's go into this code and maybe clean it up a little bit, right? So I just moved one of those strings that defined a join association or a join on this table, and I moved it up into a symbol, so I'm joining the comments table on posts. So this is a lot cleaner looking, and it's allowing ActiveRecord to introspect the associations between these two models, derive the columns to use, and then automatically construct that query for you to do the right thing. So that's awesome, but we still have a couple other problems with this code, right? We still have these question marks in the where clause, and we still have that second join. And the reason that join is not yet a symbol is because it's an association that doesn't pertain immediately to posts, right? It's joining authors in relation to comments. And by the way, in this system, authors are part of comments, not part of posts. I know it's a little confusing. So you could simplify this even further, and you could use this cool hash rocket syntax that says, even though comments and author are not, well, comments is, but author is not directly related to posts, I want to get there through comments. And so I can add this hash rocket style syntax also. But we still have these question marks. So fortunately, ActiveRecord has given us a lot over the couple of years that have passed between 2 and 3 and 4. But this is still a little bit dirty. And especially if you wanted to do something like an outer join in this join clause, or if you wanted to do something a little bit more than, say, I want to say something is equal to something else, right? A column is equal to a value. So I kind of look at this style as better, but you're still handed a great weapon and not quite using it appropriately, right? So let's look at parts of this query. I'm going to use the previous string example to identify what's wrong with these queries, but let's look at the previous query. So then we'll extract little bits of this and talk about why they're less than ideal. So you've got this join, and the first thing that's wrong with this is you have to write the words join and the words on. And that's not difficult for somebody to do. It's not difficult to type J-O-I-N on your keyboard. But it does mean that you have to know MySQL or PostgreSQL or SQLite syntax to get this done. You also have essentially no syntax checking. So you don't have any idea, having written this string, you don't have any idea that authors is an actual table or that authors.id is a column, right? All you know is that you have this string, and that's getting handed to ActiveRecord, and then it's executing it for you. Let's look at the where clause here as well. And I kind of alluded to these problems before, but we'll go over these in detail. So again, you have to know MySQL syntax. You have to know that there's an and between these two things. And which, of course, and all these syntactical issues, these may not persist across different flavors of databases. So maybe MySQL has this particular construction for and, but it could be that Postgres has a different one. And it probably doesn't, but you don't know that. It's confusing also to match arguments with question marks. I mean, how many of you have looked at a piece of code and thought to yourself, man, there are so many join conditions or so many where conditions here, and I don't know which argument matches up to which question mark? Yeah, I mean, I've done that a bunch of times. It's also not very object-oriented, right? You have this where, string, and then comma, comma, comma. It's almost functional in its style. And again, we have that no syntax checking problem. So you might think to yourself, boy, I wish there was a better way to do this. And maybe I'll do a search. And you might come across a Stack Overflow article that tells you to use strings in your queries. And you might come across RailsCast's 202, which tells you to use strings in your queries. You might find blogs. You might ask coworkers. You might ask friends, family members, or even your cat, and they'll all tell you that you should use strings in your queries. And I'm here to tell you that no, you can avoid doing that. You can keep calm. You can avoid literal strings in your queries. Let's look at the previous query, but completely, I like to use the word aRelized. This is the query aRelized. So notice that there's a bunch of cool things going on here. First, you don't have to know SQL syntax. All you have to know is Ruby syntax. And, of course, this is a little bit of a DSL, so you might have to go about learning aRel as well, learning what it can do. But that's what this talk is for. That's why you're here. Ruby syntax checking, you get that for free. So if you have an unbalanced parenthesis or you're referencing a model that doesn't exist, it will throw an exception. And you can go, and it'll fail fast. In other words, you can go and fix that bug before you deploy to production. So because ActiveRecord 3 and 4 are chainable, I mean, aRel is chainable as well. It allows you to compose queries in kind of step-by-step pattern, or step-by-step fashion. So it's also chainable. And you have none of those dang question marks. It's also a lot easier to read, at least in my opinion, because what I'm reading is Ruby, not SQL embedded in Ruby, which to me is weird. So here's what we're going to cover today. I've kind of already gone over an initial, diagram of what kind of the state of the world now. And so we're going to cover what ActiveRecord is, what aRel is. There's kind of an indistinct line separating those two, and I'll kind of try to separate that. Talk about how to reference tables and columns, what terminal methods are and why they're confusing and when they happen. We'll talk about, of course, the meat of SQL, so select, where, join, and this special thing called join association, and order. Group is way easy, so I'm not going to cover that. And, or, greater than, less than, all these great things you can do with aRel that you can't necessarily find online. And then we'll also talk about the match, which is executing a SQL-like, and in, which allows for subqueries. OK, so what is ActiveRecord exactly? Well, you all know this, but it bears repeating here. ActiveRecord is a database abstraction. So there's no need to speak a dialect of SQL. It can execute queries. It returns data back to you. And it also functions as a persistence layer. Database rows are Ruby objects. You can pull them out. You can put them back in. And they also encapsulate, in many cases, your domain logic. And I know people say no fat models, no fat controllers. But the truth is that a lot of domain logic gets shoved into those models. They contain validations. They contain all that good stuff. And they also define associations between your models. So aRel is distinct in that all that it's really used for is building queries. So it's described on its GitHub page as a relational algebra for Ruby. And that didn't make any sense to me until I started reading more, because relational algebra, those two words really I don't know how those weren't put together, but that's how they describe it. Essentially what that means is that it just builds SQL queries in an object-oriented way. It generates abstract syntax trees, or ASTs for your queries, and then uses the visitor pattern to put those out to SQL strings, and then hands those off to ActiveRecord to execute. It also enables chaining, as we talked about, because ASTs are kind of nicely composable, because all you have to do is reference a subtree in order to pull in some other branch of query logic. So one blogger also described aRel as vexingly undocumented. So you can look and find pieces of aRel all over the place, but joining that all together is something that took me a long time. In fact, this talk came out of a project that I was working on at Twitter. I work on the Twitter Translation Center. We needed to implement an access control system. And to do that, we had permissions and we had groups and all that kind of thing. And in order to join all that logic together and decide whether a user was able to see a particular phrase, it turned out that was a difficult thing to do. We would have had to do a lot of strings in our SQL queries, and we wanted to avoid that. We wanted to be able to be composable and use scoping and all that great stuff. So having done that project, I'm taking that knowledge and kind of imparting it to you. So that project was a direct reason why this talk was created. I found it very difficult to find the information I was looking for. So as a recap here, aRel knows nothing about your models. It knows very little about your database. All that it knows is that you have these queries you're trying to construct, it doesn't care if those tables exist. It doesn't care if those columns exist. ActiveRecord cares, but aRel really doesn't care. And it does not store or retrieve data. All of these are ActiveRecord's responsibility. So in summary here, aRel constructs queries, and ActiveRecord does everything else. If we were to look at this as a hierarchy, and kind of a diagram, I guess, you've got ActiveRecord, which you would interact with as a developer. ActiveRecord calls out to aRel to process a query, to form a query, and then sends that query to the database, and the data comes back, and ActiveRecord will package that into nice Ruby objects for you. So something else that bears some introduction here is what an AST is, because as DHH so eloquently put it in his keynote this morning, not everybody comes from a computer science background, and ASTs are very computer sciencey. So an AST essentially is, or really what a tree in this case, this is a basic tree. This is actually a binary tree. And what this means is that, so it's made up of nodes. Each node has left and right children, unless it's at the bottom. It's called a leaf, or it's called a leaf node. So you have left and right children. In this case, it's a binary tree because you have two children. You could have an end tree, which could have multiple children. So why are trees important? Why are they cool? Well, a tree is cool because you can represent things like equations with them, or expressions. So 5 times, parentheses 6 plus 3, you can represent this in a tree by defining a node at the root here, which is multiplication. That's an operator. And then each left and right child represents the 2 different operands of that expression, of that operator. So 5 times 6 plus 3. So the 6 plus 3 would be evaluated first because it's in parentheses. So notice also that parentheses are grouping this expression together. And then 5 times that. You can kind of expand this concept into how this would look for a SQL expression by looking at this example. So you might have a query root, and then a select from, and select has 2 columns, ID and text, and from has just 1 child post. So this would be an entry. Now, I don't actually know if this is how aRel does this in the background. This is a representation that you could imagine is going on behind the scenes. Okay, so let's get to some code. And the first thing I want to talk about is a little gem that I put together to kind of help with this talk and do some aRel things that just take kind of some of the verbosity out of aRel. So it's called aRel helpers. Go ahead and install this thing. It's got 3 kind of helpers, very small. And let's jump on from there, and we'll talk about how to reference tables and columns in aRel. So let's pretend you have this table. It's called post. It has many comments. And let's say you wanted to reference the ID in this table. Well, post.aRel table ID. So any class that inherits from ActiveRecord base has this method called aRel table. And it returns to you an instance of aRel : table that is a way of referencing your table in code. Now, brackets ID, of course, gives me what's called an aRel attribute. And I can do the same thing for text. And I can even do this for columns that don't exist. So if I wanted to derive a column, I could also use this to reference that column. Now, that's not always true, but that's almost always true. So this returns an aRel attribute's attribute. Now, you don't really care what it returns. You care that you can use it in your code. So the aRel helpers gem kind of makes this a little easier. If you include aRel helpers aRel table in your model, you can now reference columns off your tables with just square brackets and eliminate aRel table. It just delegates down to aRel table. And it still returns an attribute to you. All right, so kind of going off of that, what does this statement return? It's a little pop quiz. Does it return Rails is cool? Just an array of strings. Does it return an array of instantiated objects that are records, active records? Or does it return an active record relation? You guys might know the answer to this. Who thinks it's A? Who thinks it's B? Okay, and who thinks it's C? Nice. Okay, it is in fact C. One thing that's very cool about Rails 3 and Rails 4, ActiveRecord 3 and ActiveRecord 4, is that any of these methods, these database methods, like select, join, where, they actually return an active record relation. They don't actually execute right away. So that means that they are also chainable. So if I said post.select title, and I assign that to query, that's not actually executing anything. That's storing this intermediate AST in the variable called query. Which means that I can also say query equals query.select another column name. And then if I were to say query.toSQL, I would get out this string that ActiveRecord will send to the database to grab data from. So it's also important to notice here I've kind of introduced this toSQL method. Any ActiveRecord relation that you have, you can call toSQL on it, and it will give you the string that it would execute against the database. So that's very handy, and I'll use that throughout the whole presentation. Yeah, so relations can be chained. All right, so let's get into some of the specifics here. So let's talk about selects. We looked at select a little bit. You can actually select multiple columns using array syntax. So this is actually just ActiveRecord at this point. We're not even diving into aRel right now. And you might think, okay, so we're using this toSQL again. We get ID text from posts. Everything's great. Let's say that we wanted to get the SQL, though, for count. So we just say, give me all of the posts, the counts here. And you probably wouldn't say select ID and then count, but it's an example. So, and instead of getting back a SQL string, you instead get back a no method error. So why did that happen? Well, it turns out that count is a terminal method. So let's dive into why that happened. So being a terminal method, it's executing immediately, returning a result to you instead of giving you an ActiveRecord relation. So that's why it's good to distinguish between and know which ones are going to do this to you, right? The way to actually get a count and get a SQL string back out for it would be to kind of dive into aRel here, use your aRel table knowledge from before, and call count on an aRel attribute. And then, of course, you can pass that to select as an array and pass text as a symbol, and out comes this count like you're expecting. So let's look at what terminal methods are. So terminal methods execute the query immediately. They do not return a relation. They mostly count first and last. So first and last are kind of like array accessors, right? 2a, pluck, and any of the enumerable methods will all execute your queries immediately. So for example, this, each, over these objects, and you'd expect this to happen because this is not a lazy enumerator. This is a regular enumerator. You're iterating over all these things, and you're putting out the text, and that's obviously going to execute right away. But more surprising is this one. So if I say each slice here, and it's a lazy enumerator, in other words, I don't pass a block to it, this will also execute immediately. So just beware of that. All right, so let's go actually for real into select here now. So we've already seen how we can say .count on an array attribute. We can also say .sum, and that will give us this sum method. These are all, by the way, MySQL examples. Notice also that aRel and ActiveRecord have nicely added this as sum ID for you. So any table, any column like this will automatically get a derived column name as well. You can change that column name by adding an as here. So just chain as right on the end of sum, post visitor sum as visitor total, and that will give it kind of a custom derived column name for you. You can also say .maximum and .minimum, and these will all use kind of the built-in SQL methods that you're expecting. Let's say, though, that you're trying to run a function that isn't part of aRel's DSL or aRel's knowledge, I guess. It's kind of outside of aRel's abilities. You can actually define a function call of any arbitrary function. This covers things like length or like any of the other methods that MySQL provides or Postgres that may differ from database to database. So in this case, I'm saying a named function.new, passing in the name of the function, and then giving it an array of arguments that function takes. And then again, I'm also aliasing the result of that as length in this case, so giving it a derived column name. So we can shorten this a little bit this is a little bit verbose, by including aRel nodes. And then this just becomes named function.new. So that's kind of a little hack you can add to your queries. Something kind of also pretty cool about aRel, this is kind of one of the other little cool select things. You can also say aRel.star here. If you wanted to select every single record, right? Or every single column from the record. So select star from posts. aRel.star exists. You can use it in a bunch of different places. Okay, so many people also don't know that select and aRel and ActiveRecord, I should say, have the ability to also just specify a from. So if you want to specify a subquery inside a from, this is pretty common. You can do this instead of a join or instead of a more complicated query here. So I'm saying select ID, and then I'm passing a subquery into the from. So one thing that's really important to notice here is you'll notice at the end of the second select, I say .ast. So also at any point in your construction, you can call ast on your relation, and it'll give you back this massive tree that it's constructed. And in this case, from requires you to pass it an ast, otherwise it gets confused. It doesn't know what to do with a relation. All it knows what to do with is an ast or a column or things like that. So, or a table in this case. All right, so that pretty much covers select. There's a lot of things you can do with select. I was kind of breezing past a lot of it. If you have any questions, you can always talk to me or I guess go online, but there's not that many resources. Anyway. Okay, so the wonder of where. So where has also gotten a lot better since Rails 2. I can pass in a title, to my where here, where post or post.where title is aRel is cool, and this will do what you expect. It will say it'll construct the SQL query users.title equals this value. So no question marks here, which is very nice. But what happens if you want to, do something a little more? Oh, here's the aRel version of this. So you can do this with pure aRel. It's a little more verbose. You wouldn't really do this. But let's say you wanted to say not equal to or less than, things like that. You can do the same thing. So you can say not equal in this case, and notice that it'll put the bang equals in MySQL. You can also say kind of something cool here, not equal to nil, and it will serialize that as is not null, which is what you should be expecting. So other cool methods, greater than, GT, less than, LT, all makes sense. And all of these are just chained right off of this column attribute here. Here's greater than equal to, GTEQ, and also LTEQ. So we also, oftentimes in our queries, need to be able to and an or our way to a kind of a multiple where, right? We can do the same thing here. So if you were to say where multiple times just with ActiveRecord, it would automatically give you an and. But if you wanted to specify an or, you would need to do something like this. So we have our title attribute from post. We're saying equal aRel is cool. And the post ID is equal to 22 or 23. And notice that I've actually injected, so I've put, inside the and, I put another attribute and a .or. And this will, aRel will just know, the visitor pattern will know how to add the right parentheses to this query. So notice the output query has an and then parentheses and the or, so that no operator precedence messes us up here. Now, notice that I said equals 22 or 23. I could also have put an in here. So in also accepts arguments here that can, essentially an array of values here. So the same thing. This will have the same effect. You can also compose your wheres. You can add named functions in here. So you can also do .count, .sum, all that stuff works. Those are aggregate functions. Here's length. I'm aggregating all this stuff together. It's all just kind of works, which is pretty cool. All right, so let's get to my favorite part of aRel, and that's joins. So ActiveRecord makes joins pretty easy, except for when you're trying to do an outer join. We'll just see how that looks in a second here. So let's pretend we have this data model. It's basic blog, essentially. So you've got a post. Post has many comments, and each comment has an author. So let's see what happens when we dive into some joins here. So we say join. This is without any help from aRel. Joins comments, or comment in this case, where ID is 42. So very cool. ActiveRecord inspects this model, inspects the association between author and comment, and automatically generates the right join conditions for you. Pretty cool. You can also specify, as I mentioned, kind of a through table in this case. So I want to join comments, and then I'm using author. I've got comments, and I also want to find the posts that that comment that comment is part of. So this will also do what you expect. It'll grab all the correct attributes for the models, hook them all together. A lot of cool introspection. But again, what about outer join? So you notice back here, it's inner join. And there's really no way to specify an outer join without diving in to aRel, at least that I'm aware of. OK, so let's look at this guy again. So let's say we wanted to add an outer join to this. Well, first, it kind of bears mentioning here that you can turn this stuff into also pure aRel stuff. So we have a joins comment. We can also say comment.joinsPost and then call this method called join sources. So join sources is a way of saying I've gotten this query from ActiveRecord. So this is, again, it's just using ActiveRecord. And I just want to grab the join sources. I don't care about the select or the where. Just give me the join sources and pass that on to whoever's wrapping me, in this case, another query. You can do the same thing with the first join. And then you can also specify the on conditions manually here. So we have a join comment aRel table, and we're joining that on comment ID is equal to author comment ID, and then saying join sources. And we're doing this for both. Now, this is going to get pretty verbose, but at this point, we can finally add our outer join. OK, so notice that the attribute, aRel attribute.join, takes a third argument, or a second argument, that is the join type. So you could say inner join here or outer join. And that results in essentially the same query, but this time an outer join. You might be thinking, that is a lot of code. Why would I ever type that much code? And you're right, that's way too much code. So part of the aRel helpers library is called join association. And this will introspect your model just like ActiveRecord would do, hand those off to what's called a select manager, and then use the second argument, aRel outer join, to give you an outer join, but without all the tedium of specifying all these conditions. So I can slide this in here, join association. I supply the original model, and then the association name, and then aRel outer join. And I can do that for both of these guys. Pretty cool. But wait, there's more. All right, so you've got this guy, and you're like, I really want to supply some extra custom on conditions. Fortunately, join dependency, or join association rather, will yield a block to you that has both the association name, which is just a string or a symbol, and also a join conditions intermediate query object. So you can say join conditions and then pass in anything else you would like to construct. In this case, we're making sure that the created date is less than or equal to yesterday. So this results, again, in the same query, but this time, and it would have been an outer join, except that I actually took out, for space reasons, I took out the extra outer join call there. So this would return inner join and then an outer join. All right, so let's talk about join tables, because for so far we've been talking about tables that have defined associations between them, and those associations are not has and belongs to many. So I'm trying to kind of freshen this a little bit and say, let's talk about a table that, or two tables that are associated, but via a join table. So you might have a series of courses that are taught by a series of teachers. So multiple teachers can teach one course, and courses can have multiple teachers. So in this case, you've got three tables: courses teachers and courses underscore teachers. This is pretty common in Rails, I think. So it means you have, again, the course table. You can refer to that with course.aRel table, like we saw before. Teacher table, again, reference that with teacher.aRel table. But then we've got some magic in here for courses teachers, because there really is no model for this. There's no constant we can use to reference this table. So instead, we need to create an object for it. So we'll create an aRel table. This is doing this manually. We're giving it the name courses teachers, and now we can use this variable CT anywhere we want to refer to this table. So for example, this query. I want to say joins, and we have courses join teachers, and then just for the purposes of illustration here, I've showed what you would do in aRel to construct the join conditions here. So on this, and then .join sources. And I didn't show the SQL output of this, but I think it's pretty clear from the previous examples. Okay, so that wraps up join. So let's talk about order. Order is actually the simplest of the kind of SQL constructs I'll talk about today. You all know that you can say post.order visitors, and the visitors is an integer in this case, and then .toSQL. And this will give you a return value of all of your posts ordered by the number of visitors. You can also, and some people don't know this, but this is also just an ActiveRecord construction here. Post.order, there should be visitors. Reverse order. This will add a descending clause or a descending keyword to the end of your query. Now, you can also do this in aRel. You can say post views descending to SQL here. And this is essentially the same thing. All right, so let's talk about subqueries with in. So we talked about subqueries with from. You can also do subqueries with in, and you can use that AST as we talked about before. So here's an example of that. This is a very trivial example, but we're saying post.where, and then we say post aRel table in, and we supply it another query. So we're adding a subquery into this in call. So that's pretty cool. And it does the right thing. It adds the correct parentheses. Everything's great. All right, and then like queries with matches, you can also do this with aRel. So most of the time, you'd probably have to say, well, I'd like to, if I wanted to do a like, in other words, match, kind of fuzzy match against a column in your database, you would need to add a like, or I guess, what is it in Postgres, like? What is it, double I like or something? Anyway, yeah, so it's one of those things. So, and then usually you have to add wildcard characters to this, and this would normally be a big string in your query. But you can fix that with aRel. So post.where, and we have a matches, aRel, and then I just put my, so you do have to add these, unfortunately you have to add these wildcard characters, but it's just .matches, super easy, and that gets serialized out into a like. And interestingly enough, I didn't know this when I started out, but it looks like it's actually taking that string and encoding it into base 16 hexadecimal. All right, so we've learned all this awesome stuff about aRel. We know that it can do joins and wheres and likes and ins and all kinds of awesome stuff, all without the use of, well, mostly without the use of strings. We also have learned that it's pretty chainable. So when you think about something that's chainable, the thing that comes to mind, for me at least, almost immediately, is the builder pattern. And I think, well, why? would I want to construct a huge query inside my model or controller? I'd much rather have an object do this for me. Now, is that always the right choice? No, of course not. But it can be nice to encapsulate logic, like building a huge query. So that's why the next step, or the next point I'm going to bring up is how to construct a query builder. And this is also part of the ActiveRecord, or the aRel helpers gen that I mentioned before. So this is pretty much the entire implementation of query builder. You have something that can forward some methods for you. It'll forward 2A and 2SQL into each this variable called query inside your object. It accepts the query and sets that as an instance variable. Then it also has this kind of funky method named reflect. And reflect just instantiates a new instance of the class and adds the query. So it's essentially implementing that chaining idea. All right, so here's a lot of code. And we're going to go over each of these pieces individually. But this is a post query builder. So I was trying to query some posts. Let's look at this first method. So notice this first inherited from query builder. So let's say we have a method called with title matching. It accepts the title, calls reflect, and says .where title matches, and it adds, you can see it adds the % signs for the wildcard characters. This is all encapsulated inside this guy, so all you have to do is just call with title matching on your query builder. Let's go down to with comments by. With comments by usernames, we join comments and authors, and then where author username in usernames. So we're expecting an array of usernames. And this, again, reflects this query back to a new instance, returns a new instance of query builder to you. This time with, because we're chaining all these things, right? So now we have both, if we call both these methods in a row, we would have find by username and with title matching, both together. So the last method I have here is since yesterday. The post created at greater than or equal to date.yesterday. Which means that now I can do something like this. There's not a lot of ugly syntax in here. It's all pretty clean. Post query builder new with comments by passing an array of usernames. .2SQL, notice it's doing all the joining for me like you'd expect. I can then just say with title matching aRel. It adds that like. And then I can say since yesterday, and it will add that third condition. Pretty cool. Cool. Appreciate that. But you might be sitting here thinking, God, this is super complicated. There's got to be something out there to help me write these queries better because, it's a lot of verbosity, it's a lot of code, it's a lot of extra stuff to remember. Well, fortunately, there is. So I worked for a little while on a project called Scuttle. It was going to be called aRel, like Little Mermaid, aRel, but it was unfortunately too linguistically similar to aRel, and so I thought I would have trouble saying it on stage. So I named it after Ariel and Little Mermaid's best friend, Scuttle. So if you go to scuttle.io, you'll see a screen like this. It's an editor. You can enter in a SQL query, and at the bottom, it will convert it to aRel for you. Again, it's going to be pretty verbose, but you can tune your queries. There's a lot of other kind of text below explaining what it does. This is kind of a combination of 3 different projects, and you can check these out on GitHub if you're curious. So I could not find a SQL parser in Ruby. I tried so hard to find one of these, and there just isn't one. The only, as far as I can tell, the only SQL parsers that I could find were written in Java and using this thing called Antler, which is a parser generator. So I finally found an Antler grammar for the Apache Incubator Tajo project and grabbed that, generated these appropriate classes, and then wrote a JRuby wrapper around that allows you to parse queries. So it only works currently with select and I think insert because Apache Incubator Tajo apparently doesn't need to do anything else. So, and I wasn't ready to go write a bunch of other Antler stuff. But if somebody knows Antler around here, please help me out. We can make it better. And the third part of this is something called Scuttle Server, which is just a Sinatra app on top of JRuby that uses these 2 components. And and I forgot to mention, there's also Scuttle Java. Anyway, it uses these components to drive the website. Okay, so that was a whirlwind. I have like 5 minutes left. Thank you guys all for coming and for listening.